Recently on the Z9 users Facebook group, Damon noted that he had seen this weird characteristic in auto ISO where the dual conversion gain switchover appeared to occur at ISO 560 rather than ISO 500 as it does when ISO is in manual. So I decided to do some experimentation to see what I could figure out was going on. To do this, I created a gradient displayed on my laptop in a dark room with a black exposure prior to the image source being displayed. And then I used auto ISO and a geared tripod head so I could finally adjust the point of spot metering and get the ISOs to change over as fine as I could. And then again with ISO 500, fixed white balance, fixed focus, fixed light levels, manual exposure. There were just, the only variable was the ISO changing. The first, and then I converted them to dings using ACR, ding converter. Converted them to DNG files using the Adobe Ding Converter to eliminate any Lightroom conversion or any of those kind of potential issues. And then I opened them up in Raw Digger. And some of the information available here is the exposure. This is for the image as a whole. This is for the sample area, and this is a sample area taken from a black frame section. This talks about the red channel, green 1 channel, blue channel, and green 2 channel. Min and max values, the average value, and the variability. Variability being essentially noise. So I took the variable theta values and averaged them for each frame to give the average noise characteristic for this black frame sample area. This first image, auto ISO, we're looking at ISO 400, and the average noise of all the channels was 5.82 or theta. I then moved the metering point over slightly, and I was able to get an ISO of 450. And this had an average noise of 6.4, increasing slightly as we would expect. I moved it over again to where on this camera it said ISO 500. However, this image also reported as ISO 450 on playback. And in this case, the noise has increased again. So what this tells me is that the ISO is much more granular, linear, smaller steps than even the camera can actually report. Because you can see is the noise level has increased as the ISO has increased. Even though in 450, where it said it was at 450, and 450 where the camera said it was at 500. Then we went to ISO 500, which in manual we would expect the noise levels to drop, and it did not. In this case it increased again to 8.11. And finally for auto ISO 560. And here the noise level dropped to just a little more than half. So it is apparent that in auto ISO, the conversion gain switchover point is at ISO 560 and not ISO 500. Then I went to manual. I have manual, the average noise was 7 5.17 at ISO 400. And that actually correlates to the ISO 450 that the camera said was ISO 500 back here. So the camera display showed this as being ISO 500, but it's 450, and it correlates with the 400 in manual mode. And then in manual mode, ISO 500, we get the almost half drop in noise, average noise value. And it is apparent that the conversion gain switchover is at ISO 500 when in manual. And we look at the average noise value at 500 is approximately equivalent to ISO 560 in auto ISO. Now, I ran these tests multiple times and the noise values always varied a little bit, even between subsequent images with no changes whatsoever. So subsequent ISO 400 images, the noise values would vary a point or so. I also took a series and equalized the exposures in Lightroom at the end of this and checked it, and that did equalize the histogram exposure, but it did not change the noise value or the variability theta values notably. So what this is telling me basically is that ISO is much more granular than even the camera can report to you. So therefore, in the difference between two subsequent ISO 450 images, and that most probably ISO 500 in manual is actually ISO 560, and ISO 400 is most likely probably about ISO 450 in auto ISO. The conversion gain in all of these at each step that we've noticed has been almost about a half drop in average noise, which we would expect does seem to correlate with the just less than one stop of dynamic range improvement seen at the conversion gain changeover point. And the last thing to keep in mind is that ISO with a digital SLR isn't really a standard. This is DxO's measure of the ISO 400 as being actually 281. A big part of this is they're using different standards for determining what the ISO actually is. But understand that the ISO for DSLRs is the recommended exposure index, REI, which the manufacturer can kind of say whatever he wants to say as long as it's will get you within the ballpark of an exposure meter, which is, you know, certainly within one stop. So to wrap it up, basically, it appears that the ISO conversion gain is actually at ISO 560, and ISO 500 in manual mode is actually ISO 560. The closest you can pick manually is 640 in 1/3 stop increments. So 500, 640, 500, 560 is not really much of a swing. So to wrap it all up together, basically what you get from this test is that the ISO granularity is a lot finer than the camera can display and report to you, and that in manual mode, ISO 500 is actually ISO 560. It is just the closest 1/3 stop increment that you can select manually in the camera. And it's close enough for REI, recommended exposure index standards. So another unusual quirk of the Nikon Z9. Let me know what you think, or if you think there might be something else going on.